As Floridians recover from hurricanes Helene and Milton, red tide is starting to rear its ugly head. Blooms have already been spotted, mostly around Tampa Bay area since the beginning of October. But that doesn't mean we're out of the woods here in Southwest Florida.
Red tide was starting before Milton and maybe around the time of Helene or a little bit before Helene, naturally related to ocean processes in the Gulf of Mexico.
While one might think that these blooms are directly related to the recent hurricane activity, FGCU's Dr. Mike Parsons says not so fast.
The thing about red tide is it almost always starts in the beginning of October. That's where you'd want to put your money down if you were a betting person. And so it's just coincidence that that happens to be near peak hurricane season.
But do hurricanes like Milton and Helene impact the red tide? The short answer is it can. One of the things we saw post-Helene was a significant upwelling event along Florida's Gulf Coast.
And so that upwelling is significant for two reasons, bringing in nutrients, but also we think red tide moves along the bottom, along the seafloor, and that'll bring it up to the surface.
Another source of nutrients comes from the flush of water draining into the Gulf from our rivers, creeks, and streams. Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation recently shared this image showing the tanning waters off the Sanibel Lighthouse post-Helene and Milton.
You do have nutrients often associated with this runoff, but it's fresh water. And so red tide cannot survive in fresh water. So when you have these big runoff events, lots of fresh water, lots of nutrients, that actually creates a barrier preventing red tide from accessing that until it dilutes significantly with the Gulf of Mexico water.
Unfortunately, Dr. Parsons expects the current bloom to move south towards Southwest Florida.
Typically we get a longshore current that moves north to south. We've had this cold front come through, and I think there's another one behind it coming. Pretty steady northern wind, so that's going to help push this water to the south.
Despite that south movement, it doesn't mean the bloom will stay intact and grow. It could die off before the bloom reaches us.
Red tide is kind of like a hurricane. You know it's there. Is it coming? How long is it going to last? How bad is it going to be? And I think what we need to really focus on is how can we prepare for it.
Dr. Parsons says while some years have been exceptionally bad, red tide is not normally everywhere. He says you can typically go a mile or two down the beach and everything will be just fine. In studio, meteorologist Andrew Shipley, Fox 4.